Okay, now we're going to move on to relative clauses and the subjunctive verbs that they have. There are three times or three instances that a relative clause will require a subjunctive verb, and that is when the relative clause is either going to be expressing a characteristic of the antecedent, the purpose of the antecedent, or the result of the antecedent. Just to refresh, remember that a relative clause is a subordinate clause that is going to essentially, for all intents and purposes, act like a adjective or a descriptor of what is known as the antecedent. First and foremost, it is introduced by a relative pronoun. We should know all of them: qui, qui, quod, cui, squeeze, squeeze, quick, 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 quim, quam, quod, quod, quack, quod, qui, 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 quorum, 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 and so forth and so on. There are 30 of them for all the case, number, and gender possibilities. Then you have the word that the relative pronoun is replacing. That is called the antecedent. In this instance, we have a choice of Titus, or the boys, or the building. I know that it is building because the antecedent and the relative pronoun are going to have two things in common. Not case, but they will have the same number and the same gender. The relative clause, then, is going to be able to not stand on its own because the relative pronoun is a subordinating word, but it will have its own subject and it will have its own verb. And the case, number, and gender of the relative pronoun, the case is determined by its function in its own clause. So for example, let's look at this one. That is a regular relative clause, not one with a subjunctive verb. And here it is going to be that Titus showed to the boys a big building, which Caesar had placed in the forum. Quote here is singular because building is singular. It is neuter because building is neuter. But here it is accusative because in its clause it is functioning as the direct object. Let's look at a couple more. Let's go to number 3. Aurelia was looking for the merchant to whom she gave the money. And so here, that is singular because its antecedent is singular. Cui could be masculine, feminine, or neuter. It is masculine because its antecedent is masculine. And it is dative because in its own clause, it is functioning as the indirect object. So, that being the case, let's look at subjunctives, relative clauses. So, when a relative clause has a subjunctive verb, there is a reason as to why that verb is subjunctive and not regular old indicative, and those reasons are 3 in number. One is the relative clause of characteristic, the other is the relative clause of purpose, and then you have the relative clause of result. The more common, or the most common one, is the relative clause of characteristic. Now, if you remember that indicative implies specificity, and subjunctive implies non-specificity, you understand the nature of the relative clause of characteristic. When the relative clause has an indicative verb, then the relative pronoun is referring to the specific antecedent mentioned, the exact one, the. But when the verb is subjunctive in the relative clause, the relative pronoun refers not to the specific antecedent, but the kind or the type of antecedent. With a subjunctive, the clause tells us about a characteristic of the antecedent. The indicative tells us about the specific exact antecedent. Now, if you don't understand this quite yet, that's understandable. Let's take a look. These two sentences are identical. Cornelia puella est, qui omnes pueri flores. And the only difference is the one has dant and the other has dent. Let's go ahead and get rid of the spelling suggestions. There we are. Dant from do dare is indicative. Dent from do dare is subjunctive. We, fear giant liar. Both of them will translate the exact same way. Cornelia is a girl to whom all the boys give flowers. The difference is that when you have the indicative verb in the relative pronoun or the relative clause, then we are saying that Cornelia is the specific, indicative means specific, girl to whom all the boys give flowers. She's the one girl to whom all the boys give the flowers. Whereas the second one is not saying that she is the specific girl, Since we have subjunctive as the verb of the relative clause, we are saying that she's the kind of girl. She's the type of girl. She's the characteristic or has the characteristic. And that's why it's called the relative clause with a subjunctive of characteristic. That is the huge difference. Now, very often, what will happen is that the antecedent will be modified with a word like talis, talis, tale, which means the sort of or such. So here it is. Marcus was wanting. I'm always terrible with subject-verb agreement. Marcus wanted talem uxorum, the kind of wife, the sort of wife, such a wife, quae, and we have a subjunctive, curaret, an imperfect subjunctive that, of course, has a present infinitive plus an ending, who would take care of, who might take care of the children the best. And since we have a subjunctive, we are not referring to a specific wife, but the kind of wife, and it is showing the characteristic. Number 2, the relative clause of purpose. Exactly as it sounds, it merely is the relative clause giving the purpose of the antecedent or the action involving the antecedent. What you could easily do is that when you have a relative clause of purpose, replace the relative pronoun with an ut, and it would not have any change in meaning whatsoever. So let's look at the examples that I've given here. The Romans did send Caesar to Gaul. Caesar, who would conquer, vinceret, from vinco, vincere, an imperfect subjunctive, the Gauls themselves. And so, here when we have the subjunctive, we're not saying that he's the kind of Caesar who would conquer the Gauls themselves. We're saying that it's the purpose of the Caesar being sent to Gaul. And so, look at the sentence, and all I've done is replace the qui with an ut, and thus it is exact same meaning. The Romans sent Caesar to Gaul so that he might conquer the Gauls themselves. And so it is the relative clause of purpose. Finally, we have the relative clause of result. Again, is exactly like it sounds. It is when the relative clause is giving a result of something. Homo tam fortis est. The man is so strong who is not able, winky, a passive infinitive, short ere, turns to an I, to be defeated, is a man who is not able to be defeated. And look, we can replace it with an ut, or result clause. It has the exact same meaning. The man is so strong that as a result, ut, he is not able to be defeated. And so in this way, here, we are merely indicating that the relative clause is the result of the man being so strong. Of these three, the one that you see probably the most often is that relative clause of characteristic. So if you see a subjunctive verb as the verb, that's an indicative, that's subjunctive, of the relative clause, it might be telling you the antecedent is not the antecedent we're talking about, but the kind of antecedent that we are talking about. And so that is it. The relative clauses that all will require a non-specific subjunctive verb. Remember, the key is non-specificity. So, nevertheless, those are the three uses there. The next installment is merely a quick run-through of these clauses. Now, I'm not even going to have a study guide for them. Number 16, 17, and 18, they are called the proviso clause, dumodo. All you need to know is that when you see dumodo and you have a subjunctive verb, it is a proviso clause, which merely means it gives a provision, and dumodo is translated as provided that. That's all you need to remember. Dumodo means provided that, and it requires a subjunctive verb. That's all there is. Whenever there is an expression of doubt, it will then possibly be followed by the word quin, and it's called the quin clause of doubt. And quin merely translates that. I doubt. What's the next word out of your mouth? That. And I have a doubt. That. And that quin is the word that is translated as that. And it's the quin clause of doubt. And then you have a subjunctive, sometimes with a doom clause, while, or until, donec, which means until, and quoad, which also means until. So these three clauses that you have right here, 16, 17, and 18, I don't have a study guide for them because it's not really necessary. It merely is come down to the fact that you need to know that dumodo means provided that, have a subjunctive verb probably, and it is a provision. When, that, and it is introduced by a doubt that is expressed, and then while, until, and until. Those are words that are subordinating words. They will subordinate whatever clause that they have, and they also then are going to be the words that require a subjunctive verb. Now, the very last one, which I do have a study guide, are these. Remember, these are the independent uses of the subjunctive. So, hope you pay attention, and best of luck.